Welcome, everyone. Thank you for tuning in and watching our PD session for choosing the best fit assessments to support student learning. Today, you have with you Sarah Powell. That's me speaking right now. I am an instructional designer at the Learning and Teaching Services. My email is on screen, and I work with faculty to improve everything to do with curriculum from the very beginning course outline and CSI, as well as any of the content and assessments throughout that full development. Shanna.
Hi, everyone. My name is Shanna Passmore, and I am the Academic Integrity Facilitator. So I'm working with the Academic Integrity Office, Sandra Larwell and Julia Huckle, through academic integrity issues. And I'm also a part-time faculty member in the School of Business.
So today we're going to talk to you about overall assessment strategies, as well as ways to mitigate academic integrity issues. But to start off with, we're also going to look at some andragogy principles, as well as overall foundation for assessment, so we can build off of that. So first, you've probably heard the term pedagogy before, but maybe not andragogy. Pedagogy focuses specifically on the learning and teaching of children. And it wasn't until about the 1950s that we had a switch to actually focus on the needs and motivations of adult learners, and that being different. So it was Malcolm Knowles that adopted the term andragogy to focus specifically on the needs of adult learners, as well as the educational experience that they bring to those classrooms. Primarily, adult learners are self-directed and rely heavily on their past experience to inform their learning. And therefore, as instructors and faculty members, we should design curriculum that utilizes these experiences and the adult goals to improve their engagement with course material and overall educational success. Here we have specific principles that adult learners will say come into the classroom with that have been identified by Malcolm Knowles, and a lot of research since then has continued to build on this. Adult learners need to know why they are learning the content. So they might be self-directed way more so than younger students, but they still need to know why. And that might actually be including their involvement in the planning or evaluation of the course, but it also could be through self-reflection and self-evaluation throughout their learning experience. They also need to learn through experience. So that's both building on their prior experience, but also using experience in learning in the classroom. And this also includes making mistakes. A big difference between pedagogy and andragogy tends to be the fact that adult learners want to rely heavily on problem solving to learn rather than content acquisition. So they are process and task oriented. Teaching strategies should reflect this through focusing on role-playing and case studies, simulations, and as much hands-on activities as possible, rather than just a lot of theory and lecture style learning. And in particular, with later on how we'll touch on authentic assessments, adult learners need to learn best, they learn best when information is of immediate relevance. So whether that is to their current job, to their overall career goals, or even where it's placed within a particular program of study, but the information they're learning needs to be immediately applied to their lives. Next, we're going to look at some assessment best practices. Primarily, we're focusing on backward design, the purposes of assessment, and feedback. So if you're watching this, you probably have some of it, so this might be a bit introductory or a bit brief. There are other resources that you can check out on the LTS website for further information. But with backward design, you need to know the destination before you can plan your route. It's a bit of an analogy. So you need to know what your students should know by the end of the course and able to effectively design that curriculum. At Algonquin, we already have those desired results or the destination, and those are your course winning requirements or your CLRs. At the end of the course, it is very clearly stipulated in the course outline what a student should be able to know, do, behave, think. And then you need to work backwards by planning how you are going to know as the instructor that they have learned it. That's the assessment evidence. So you start with your learning outcomes, then you plan how you're actually going to assess that they have achieved those learning outcomes, and then you continue to work your way backwards to plan activities and content that support student success. So this is in terms of the actual content that's available either on Brightspace or in class, but also the different learning activities, and even sometimes the smaller assessments that they might experience throughout that course. The bigger piece here is the purpose of assessments. Now, typically we tend to focus on 3 of them, but assessments all have different purposes, and they should be used throughout teaching to provide feedback to the students as well as feedback to yourself to identify any of the gaps and start to address that in your teaching. First, you have diagnostic assessments, and that's to find out where your student baseline is. This should be ungraded, typically happens within the first week, and it could be something as simple as an ungraded quiz or writing a paragraph or even a quick interview with students to find out how much they already know about the content so that you can make adjustments accordingly. The next and sometimes the biggest piece that we're working with instructors on how to improve are formative assessments. And this is after some teaching has occurred to judge how much of the actual learning has occurred. They should be low risk, but high reward. So that is something that is of low percentage, but they're getting a lot of good feedback from the instructor, as well as, again, giving the instructor feedback about where the students at large are in where they are in the class and how they might need to continue to either reteach something, reinforce something, or they've really got this and you can actually probably move at a quicker pace. So formative assessments should be happening several times throughout a course, continuously as they are learning. Finally, and this is the biggest piece that most instructors are usually familiar with, and that's the summative assessments. These are the formal evaluations after the teaching has concluded. So unlike the formative, it's in the middle of the cycle and they have more opportunity to then use that feedback to either try again or put it into a new assessment. With summative, there is no more teaching, there's no more learning, at least within the course, and you are just judging how much of that course they've actually, or the content that they've actually learned. Feedback is not inherently needed at this point because they don't have any opportunities to apply it to later assessments. It still might be good depending on the type of assessment, whether it's an exam or an essay or a presentation. Lastly, and we'll touch on this a little bit later as well, feedback should be meaningful, and it is imperative to be meaningful for student progress. So they need to use that feedback to build on their experience and then take that feedback and integrate it into their next assessments, which, thinking back to our adult learners, also helps create relevance for adult learners. Effective feedback should be timely, clear, and meaningful. Timely, clear, and meaningful. So at Algonquin specifically, we have policy AA13 that does state that evaluations should be, with meaningful feedback, should be provided within 10 working days. Now, clear and meaningful also demonstrates that it shouldn't just be something like, well done, or good work, or this needs improvement, but identifying the areas that they need to make an improvement, possibly pointing out other resources that they could touch base with again, or even something like, oh, this was covered in week 4, you might want to review it before the next assignment. So again, making sure your feedback is timely, clear, and meaningful, and that assessment practices or purposes, should be utilized throughout the course and in a variety of ways. now to Shanna for academic integrity.
Okay, so at Algonquin, we have historically had two policies that address academic integrity, AA 18 and AA 20. They are now gone and have been replaced with a single policy, AA 48. And this policy is trying to focus on our college values. We're putting an emphasis on the college core values for students to kind of encourage them to be acting in an academic integral way. So this is one of the definitions from the new policy, and it was an existing definition in our old policies that we're carrying forward and we're going to use as a point of emphasis for students moving forward. So some of the best practices for academic integrity that we are recommending, and these recommendations are based on a lot of common issues and cases that we've seen come through the Academic Integrity Office, is that there is a need for extremely detailed and clear expectations in any assessment instructions you are giving. So while sometimes we might think something is an obvious expectation, we would rather you include that expectation in writing so that there is no chance of confusion and possibly academic integrity issues occurring. Similarly, we want to encourage the creation of assessments that are not readily or easily copied or reused. This is a challenge, we recognize that, but later on we're going to give you some suggestions for how this could be possible. We also want to encourage faculty to avoid recall-based assessments if possible. We understand that sometimes there are governing and legal bodies that are dictating certain assessments that need to be given, and those questions are set. But for anything that you as faculty are creating or are responsible for, and it isn't based on a governing body, we want to try and avoid recall-based assessments if possible. And when I say recall-based, if, as an example, you had a quiz on content and you asked students to define a particular term, and that term happens to have been in your notes for the student and they memorized that particular term. If they are providing the answer and it's a word for word recall of what you provided them, you might suspect plagiarism if you've told them that they aren't allowed to use resources, but that may not actually be true. Their learning style might be to memorize. So we would want to avoid such type of questions because it's hard to distinguish whether or not someone has cheated or whether or not this is just how they demonstrate learning. So an example, and we'll get into this a little bit more, would be asking instead for them to explain how a particular term is relevant in their field or in a particular area. And that term needs to be understood. The definition of that term needs to be understood in order for them to be able to describe these details. So that would be a better approach to something such as a question around defining a term. The other thing we're recommending is that we refresh assessments as much as possible. And we say this recognizing that there is often a shortage of time for faculty to do this. So we do have some examples of how we could quickly make minor modifications to refresh assessments each academic year by changing simple elements such as if you define what resources are allowed, you would change those resources annually. You would change research topics annually, but the core of the assignment is the same. Or maybe you change the style of the activity. One term, it's a written report. The next term, it's an oral report, but you still address the same CLRs. With respect to academic integrity and group work, this is an area of common issue. So we just wanted to provide some suggestions and feedback around that. We want to make sure that when you are doing group work activities, you're providing your groups with the resources to support good collaboration and teamwork. There is often the assumption that students know how to work with others, and this is not always the case. And that's where we see group work breakdown. So we want to make sure that we're providing them with resources. This doesn't necessarily mean that faculty have to teach their students how to be good team members, but you can provide infographics, and we have created them for you to just put into your course shells on how to work well with others and suggestions on how to be a good team player in a group work situation. We also want to encourage or suggest the avoidance of group projects where a group submits a shared final paper. We do recognize that sometimes it's important for this to occur. So if this is something that you want to do and it's an important element of your course, we're not saying don't do it. When possible, try and avoid it. And the reason for this is because if you have a shared final paper, and maybe one member out of 5 commits an academic incident by plagiarizing or maybe failing to reference content that they have sourced or cited, then the whole group is held accountable. And that is sometimes not very fair to members who have done their due diligence to reference and cite properly and have not created errors in their elements of a final paper. So that's the type of thing that we're looking to try and avoid if possible. If it's not possible, then we want to be educating our students on how they can use Turnitin to check their group papers before the deadline. And if they catch an area of their paper that a particular member was responsible for and see that there is copied content, they can make corrections and address it with that group member and resubmit with the hope that they won't be penalized for any plagiarism omissions or errors. So that is the premise for why we are recommending the avoidance of shared final papers. But again, we do recognize that in life, it is important that you own something that your name is attached to. So again, if this is something that is important to your class and the CLRs and the demonstration of ownership in a group shared final paper, then the recommendation is to teach your students how to use Turnitin similarity report information to check their peers' work, because we can't know just by looking at a document if content has been copied. So teaching them how to use that and giving them the ability to use that, set your assignment folders up with the ability for students to see their similarity reports, and then allow for resubmissions if students find errors. And then lastly, we want to make sure that we're being clear about referencing expectations. So this kind of ties to what I already alluded to with the group work final paper. If you are going to hold the entire group accountable for any referencing omissions, then you need to stipulate that in the initial instructions so that they know to do their due diligence. So tell the students, if one of you fails to reference, all of you will be held accountable and all of you will be written up for an academic incident. They need to know that so that they are checking each other's work and know to check each other's work. All right. When it comes to individual activities, similar to the group work, we want to make sure that we are providing detailed instructions about what is and isn't permitted. So with individual activities in mind, things such as, are they allowed to collaborate with others when they're working on an individual activity? You need to state that in the instructions, because if you don't state it, it becomes a gray area and students will likely collaborate. And if you don't want them collaborating and they do collaborate, but your instructions don't stipulate that collaboration is not allowed, it's that gray zone. So we just want to, again, add more detail about what is and isn't permitted in all of our activity or assessment instructions. The other thing that we're recommending is to add some type of reflective component to individual activities, whether that be oral or written, to kind of help confirm the authorship of the work. So I know that during our COVID era, there has been an increase in concern around who is doing the work and is it authentically the student that is getting the grade? Have they done the work? Because we can't always check that and we can't be sure. Adding these individual reflective components into activities does kind of help to support that cross-check of authorship. So here are a couple examples of assessment instructions and changes that we would recommend. So we'll just go through these one at a time. The left column is the original instruction, and then the right is our recommendation for an alternate. So in that first instruction, complete assignment XYZ and submit by the deadline, standard instruction, but we're just suggesting you add a little bit more detail to that so that there is clear guidelines for the student. So you can start with the same kind of suggestion, complete assignment XYZ and submit. But as opposed to submit by deadline, submit to and identify the specific folder in Brightspace where they're submitting the work and the date with which they need to submit by. And then the last sentence there is the real add-on. Please know that this assignment is an individual activity and collaboration is not permitted. Does this mean students will not collaborate? No, we can never 100% stop students from collaborating if this is a take-home assignment where they could reach out to their friends or they have a study group. But at least with this particular statement, it is very clear to the students that they are not to be collaborating. And if you catch collaboration or see that collaboration has occurred, you have this to fall back on, to direct the students to and go, I did say no collaboration was permitted, you collaborated, and now you are going to be written up for that collaboration, unauthorized collaboration. The next example is what I alluded to earlier with recall-based questions. So if the original question is define the term integrity, this is something that could easily be memorized or seemingly copied. So to avoid that, we recommend you putting it in a different way that still shows that the student understands the term and its definition, but it asks them to elaborate. And this actually creates a personalized approach where you can authenticate that the student is the one giving the answer. So explain what integrity is and how it is essential in your future career. They need to know what integrity is in order to explain how it's essential in their future career. And because they're explaining how it's essential in their future career, you're adding that kind of reflective component inside of asking them to explain whether or not they understand a term. The next instruction, write a reflection paper on what you learned from the article and how it relates to current industry practices. An alternate to that would be create a video presentation of yourself presenting your key takeaways from the article and how you feel it relates to current industry practices. I have actually used this approach where I have asked students to create a really short 2-3 minute video. They can use their phones to do it. They can use their web cameras to do it. It's really not a challenge at this day and age for students to create videos of themselves. So create a quick video of themselves presenting key takeaways. And this kind of covers that reflection component that you're asking for, but it also authenticates the authorship. because you're visually seeing the student and hearing the student deliver their key takeaways for that article. So that's an alternate that we recommend. The next one, write an essay on plagiarism and how it negatively impacts your future career. So our recommendation for this, and this kind of addresses the change up your resources and be clear about your citations. The alternate is write an essay on plagiarism and how it negatively impacts your future career. Same question, but here's the extra detail. Use the following 2 journal articles to help you develop your argument. You are giving them the resources that they are permitted to use. So if they go and use resources outside of what you've permitted, you can flag that with them. That is a deviation to what's being asked. You also are stating APA referencing and works cited are required. Very clear about the type of citation style, and that you need referencing included in this particular activity. And there could be more to this instruction, but this is getting down to being able to create a unique assessment each term. You could change those 2 journal articles every academic year, and that will change up the type of answers that you're getting from your students, and it will help to authenticate the work that's being submitted to you. The last instruction here, this is an instruction that does exist in some assignments that we have seen and in some school documentation that we have seen. And we want to instead recommend an alternate. When we state that plagiarism will result in a 0% on the assignment, that is actually not always true. We can't state that because as faculty, we are actually not permitted to apply sanctions to students. Academic administrators are the only ones that can apply sanctions, and giving students a 0 if you have found or suspect plagiarism is you applying a sanction. So an alternate that gets the same message across, if you feel like this is an important message you want to relay to the students, is if plagiarism is suspected, an academic incident report will be filed against you, and possible sanctions such as a 0% on the assignment may occur. So this still sends the same message that if plagiarism occurs, they could potentially get a 0%, but it leaves it in the hands of the academic administrators investigating the incident report to apply that sanction to the student if they find that the student is in fact guilty. And that sanction may in fact change if there's a history. So we just want to, again, make sure that we're not prescribing that we are going to give them a 0. We want to relay the importance of not plagiarizing and that there are repercussions for plagiarizing, and just leave it in the hands of the academic administrator to apply those sanctions. So this is a huge definition, but this is the definition of plagiarism from our new academic integrity policy. And so plagiarism, obviously, whether done deliberately or accidentally, is obviously presenting someone else's work as our own. So in whole or in part as one's own. We have listed all of the things that this pertains to, but it's not exhaustive. We just want to give students a really good understanding that a lot of things can count as plagiarism, so you need to be aware, including self-plagiarism. So the resubmission of one's own work, ideas, or artistic expressions without the acknowledgement of that work, or without at least the permission from the professor to resubmit work that you've already created, is considered self-plagiarism and can be written up. So with that in mind, we're going to take a look at what Turnitin can do to help us interpret whether or not plagiarism has in fact occurred. So this is an example of a Turnitin similarity report. and it is showing a high percentage. And there is a question whether or not high percentages actually mean a student has plagiarized. And the answer to that is no. So this is a template that has been used, and the student was asked to use this template to fill in their answers. So in the boxed area underneath all of that red highlighted content is the student's actual answer. The content above is the canned template instructions. So they are 100% going to be highlighted because multiple students have submitted the same template. So that's where the high 80% percentage is going to be picked up from. You can see this information when you look at your little panel bar on the right. There's a blue area and then there's a red area. You can see the number 80 is highlighted with red, and I have clicked on that number 80 to turn my highlights on, because unless you've clicked on that, your highlights don't show. So this is an important step to showing what has actually been copied in the content that's been submitted. Now, this was a paraphrasing activity that I had the students complete, and they were to paraphrase the article that they read. The things that have been highlighted in here are, some of them is general, so it's the name of the article first. So I wouldn't penalize the student for typing in the name of the article, because that is, they cannot get away from writing that word for word. So that is fine. Then underneath that, there are a few extra highlights. This is so minimal that I would not count this as plagiarism. Now, if there were exact full sentence lines that were highlighted that don't have proper quotation or in-text citation references, then that is plagiarism. So if the word "according to these experiment," you can see that there's some grammatical errors here. If they had from "according" all the way down to the end of that long, or 2 oaths, if that whole line was highlighted in red with a tag beside it, so the number 1, then I would know that that was a direct copy from the resource that has been improperly cited, and I would flag that as plagiarism. But in this particular example, this paraphrasing itself is not plagiarism. So when it comes to whether or not you've suspected plagiarism, if you do suspect plagiarism and you are filing an incident report, you need to provide this Turnitin results page to the academic operations planning chairs. So Sandra Larwell, Julia Huckle. So you'll add this file, this Turnitin report file, to the files that you submit for your incident, because that is the evidence that you need to give the chairs so that they can look at it and approach the case as needed. So this is the type of evidence that you would want to share with your with the chairs when you submit your academic incident report.
All right, now back to me for some alternative assessments. And this is another way to attempt to mitigate any academic integrity offenses, as well as building on the needs and experiences of our adult learners. So first and foremost, it's important to note that you might have heard terms alternative assessments or authentic assessments. They do tend to get used interchangeably, but we'll say alternative assessment is sort of the larger umbrella, and then authentic assessment is something under that umbrella. So an alternative assessment is a creative attempt to move away from traditional approaches to assessments to address learner variability and better assess learners when adopting to new learning modalities. So this has certainly been included more and more in courses since we've moved to remote learning. But it's of course also our hope that these activities also continue to play a bigger role going forward when we're back face to face. So ultimately, they do include any assessment that offer opportunities to accommodate our learners. Traditional assessments tend to rely more on, we'll say, either simple or lower level thinking, so more knowledge and comprehension. Alternative assessments push students to actually demonstrate their learning through application and analysis, and even at the very top level, sometimes creation. So it provides students with choice and makes it more relevant to the learner, which, as discussed earlier with Malcolm Knowles, is a key motivator for adult learners. So some examples might include analyzing case studies, writing reflections, developing infographics, a portfolio of a student work, even open book exams are sort of an intro level to alternative assessments because they're using the resources that they've been provided rather than sit in a room, it's timed, and you have to answer multiple choice questions. This is something that students would experience more in the real world once they're actually out into the workforce. So under alternative assessments, like I said, we have the more focused, authentic assessment. So at the college level, students want content and assessments that actually mirror what they'll be doing in their chosen industry, and to also continue to be assessed through problem solving. Authentic assessments push students to demonstrate their learning in tasks that, again, as close as possible, either mirror the exact expectations of the industry or the workforce, or at least are building and practicing those skills. So it helps prepare them for life after graduation. So as we remember from our previous friend that we mentioned early on, Malcolm Knowles, adult learners, they want to know why they're learning what they're learning. They want to be able to apply it as soon as possible. So this is certainly true of authentic assessments. And they also want real life problem solving, not just memorization. So I'm going to read you something specifically from another educational theorist named Grant Wiggins, which is also sort of the, we'll say, father of authentic assessments. Authentic assessments require students to be effective performers with acquired knowledge. Traditional tests tend to reveal only whether the student can recognize, recall, or plug in what was learned out of context. So therefore, authentic assessments should mirror the challenges adult learners will experience and prepare them for, like I said, over and over, it is preparing them for the workforce, but it also helps increase student motivation. And because of the fact that they're building on typically creation, it is even more likely that it's their authentic work as opposed to getting, plagiarizing, collaborating. So specific characteristics of authentic assessments. So first and foremost, it's realistic. It resembles real world tasks or activities. It might require judgment and innovation, and it's asking the student to do the subject as opposed to just simply tell me about the things that you remember doing. It can be written, oral, or project-based. It could be individual or group. So it's really varied in its application in the classroom. It's often loosely structured problems with no right answer. So it might be like earlier, here is a case study, use what you've learned to provide a solution, or here are all of the financial figures and develop a budgeting report. So that even different students within the classroom might have different answers based on their experience and their interests. Usually is addressed to lay audience or professionals. So it's not just about doing something because they have to, but it's there's like a pseudo professional that they are tailoring this to, again, as closely mirrored as possible to that real world, giving them that practice. It allows for opportunities to practice and rehearse, consult resources, use feedback, and continue to sometimes refine performances and products. This then ties back to even purposes of assessments in that hopefully you're using cycles of formative assessments and then summative assessments. So that could be something that's built in formatively, but then that end product is a summative assessment. Now, similar to the examples used with alternative assessments, some examples might include writing memos, professional emails, doing presentations, already a very popular one, budget proposals, case studies, manuals, doing demonstrations. So a lot of hands-on trades, hospitality type courses throughout the college already use these. Any type of a media or trade project coming up with mock-ups for app design is another great one, as opposed to just answering questions maybe about the software, but now we're putting it into practice. There's definitely areas throughout the college that this is easier to do than others. It requires creative thinking, even in terms of writing the instructions and coming up with the grading tool to then assess it. And admittedly, it can be a larger grading load than some of the more traditional assessments, but students are more invested in doing it because they can immediately apply it. It's relevant to their workforce, and it also builds on problem solving and creativity rather than recall. So thank you for listening to all of this. As a recap, we've touched on backward design, assessment practices, both from a foundational point to more focused in terms of alternative and authentic assessment. Shanna's touched on in wonderful detail the importance of academic integrity, what to do, some mitigation strategies throughout that. Shanna, do you want to add anything else?
Yeah, if you guys would like to get some additional resources, infographics that have been created for both faculty and students, for the students on group work, what is allowed during an open book exam, what isn't allowed, things of that nature have already been created. And you might be looking for that just so that you can share that with your student. There's also infographics for faculty around alternative assessments and canned messages or instructions that you can just copy paste into your existing assessment activity instructions that provide that extra detail that I went through. So if you are looking for that and you would like it, you can go ahead and reach out to me. My email was at the beginning of this presentation, and you can just send me an email and I'll send them your way.
Awesome. Thank you. Thanks for listening, everyone.